Welcome to part 2 of repairing plaster with Big Wally's plaster magic and with traditional plastering methods. In this episode, I'm finishing up the project I started in part 1. So if you didn't see that, you should probably go back and watch it now. And here I am removing the blue clamps from the Big Wally's part of the project. The adhesive glued them to the wall, so when I pried them off with my pocket knife, they took off some of the paint, but I'm testing the wall here and it feels really solid, so I'm quite happy with how it worked out with Big Wally's plaster magic. Here I am putting the first finish coat. Does that make sense? First finish coat? The first coat of pure plaster over the scratch coat into the big hole that I had in the wall. And I've got my pickle bucket, so I have plenty of room to mix, and a 3-inch putty knife, which is what I had on hand. So I'm filling in the great big divot that I made, and then all these little tiny screw holes and holes that I made for the Wally's Plaster Magic adhesive to go through and glue the plaster back to the lath. So I've just built the surface up as close to level as I can tell and am smoothing the plaster out. I go a little overboard smoothing. I love a little too much instead of too little. I kind of love the plaster to death, which isn't the best idea. You might as well just put it on and then use a wet sponge and knock the high spots off later after it's just gotten a little bit hard, which is what I'm doing now. You can see this pretty intense shadow that's been apparent throughout the video. That's because I'm using light from the end of the wall, and it casts that long shadow on purpose. It helps highlight the imperfections in the plaster so that you can get as close to a smooth flat surface as possible. You can tell it's a nice day out. This is the second top coat, I guess. Then I'm wearing my cowboy hat, which I wear on warm days when I'm out gardening. So I bet that day I was alternating between plaster work indoors and gardening work outdoors. I was having some trouble with the plaster adhering this time around. So you can see me kind of going over some spots and adding a little more plaster here and there. I keep trying to tidy up different spots and then making it a little bit worse again. It turns out I think that the plaster this time around wasn't mixed as well as it could have been, and I didn't wet the wall. So I got all of this blistering in that coat of plaster, which was pretty distressing. So I went back and I washed the wall down with a wet sponge and I scraped it with my putty knife. Unfortunately, there in the lower corner of the screen you can see a big divot that I made. Accidentally gouged it out. It was less dry than the plaster surrounding it. I think that area was a little bit deeper, but I just went over the surface with a damp sponge and used the corner of my trowel and my finger to collapse all the plaster blisters and to scrape off the ridges wherever I could. It was a little bit of a bummer, but I really liked the way that scraping over the partially dried plaster with my putty knife helped smooth out things, and it's better than sanding because I didn't get a bunch of plaster dust up into the air. So I just continued to work from the outside of the hole inward as best I can and try and take down the ridges. I'm using 2 hands on my putty knife in a lot of spots because that prevented the corners from digging in and making gouge marks. And that's what it looked like when I finished with that layer. Next time I was ready to work, I was ready to do some sanding. I wanted to really make the surface as flat as possible, given that there were going to be some divots here and there, but the overall plane of the wall I wanted to be homogeneous. So I've got this big sanding plate and some plaster mesh sandpaper, which I had left over from a job years and years ago, and sanding with the shop vac so that I'm picking up the dust right as it comes out of the sander. I felt like sanding by hand was going to produce a lot less dust in my apartment than using a palm sander or something like that. And then wetting down the wall and washing some of the plaster dust off, and still using a little moisture to smooth out the high spots. And then here I am filling in the divots. I have back to my paint can. I didn't need to mix that much plaster. And at this point, because the surface of the wall is relatively flat, you can use the wall itself as a guide, and just scrape over it with the front edge of your putty knife, and it keeps you from smushing the plaster in and making a divot too much, or making too much of a ridge. Although the old plaster has a lot of layers of paint on it, and it's pretty unsmooth. At this point, it's kind of rough and ridgy. So there's a relatively obvious difference between the new plaster and the old plaster. And here I am getting ready to put the molding back on. The paint and plaster around the edges of the molding were such that it was just like putting a puzzle piece back in place. I didn't really have to measure or anything, but I did just fill in the nail holes with a little more plaster so that the nails would have something to grab onto again. As I nailed the nails back into their original holes, most of the time they held, but particularly on the vertical piece, sometimes they didn't. That piece is bowed, so I added extra nails and hammered them in at angles. I'm using a hammer, and I found the hammerhead when I was a kid in a river, and a family friend helped me make a handle for it at the time, which was just a little piece of 2x4 or something, and then I made a new hammer handle for it years ago. And I'm using my pocket knife screwdriver as a nail set. And here I've got a sanding block, and I'm using a really fine grit sandpaper so I don't knock the plaster out of those shallow paint divots that I plastered over. And I'm plastering along the side of this molding here because the molding had bowed over so many years of being stuck to a bowed wall, that it really wouldn't sit flat anymore. Plus there was a lot of paint buildup underneath where the molding ran, and I just didn't want to scrape that off and then make more divots. And a little coat of primer on the wall, and there's the outlet cover. So here it is, the finished plaster project. The Big Wally's Plaster Magic system, which took care of this part of the wall, was excellent. It was really easy to use. I thought it was a little expensive when I bought it, but when I saw how much time it saved, I feel like it's totally worth it. And then putting new plaster in this section that was so far gone I had to pull it out was tedious. It took a lot of time, but if you set your standards high and you just keep at it, you can have a really good result, just like this. Project Happy Life is about tackling projects that lead to a happier life, and it certainly makes me happy not having my foot go through a hole in the wall anymore. So get out there and do some work with your hands, fix something, make something, do something that makes your life just a little bit better. It'll make you feel good too. All right, click like if you want, subscribe if you want. I hope you learned something. I know I did. Enjoy. Thanks for watching. Bye.